Hello, Pranam. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for those of you who have logged on for today's webinar. We'll um, just start doing our introductions, etc., as people join us, because I can see people are still coming through. So I'll just give it another few seconds, um, just until numbers even off a little bit. But thank you all of you for being with us today and being so prompt. So yeah, to make a start by way of introductions, my name is Stefan Evans, and I'm CEO here at the Bevan Foundation. And for those of you who could have joined us today, I'm a white man with glasses and a white jumper on today. In terms of what we're going to be talking through today, I've got a little bit of housekeeping before I hand over to my colleague Joel, who's going to talk you through the substance of the report, I guess, and what we've got to share. As I'm sure most of you are familiar with by now, kind of your cameras and microphones are off, but you will have an option of being able to ask questions during the webinar by using the Q&A function. So can I ask that you use the Q&A function rather than the chat function? Because that makes it just easier for us to track if they're all in one place. So pop in any questions you want as we go through, but we'll have time to come to them at the end. I think that's it for me in terms of a general housekeeping. Just pleased to have all of you here. And Joel, if I hand over to you, I'll share my screen so I've got the slides for you. And yeah, fire away.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. Hi, everyone. Just to say, I'm Joel Davis. I'm a policy and research officer here at the Bevan Foundation. And to describe myself, I'm a white male in my mid-30s with short brown hair, and I'm wearing a blue jumper today. So just as Stefan gets the slides up. So this is our latest snapshot of poverty report for you today. And our snapshot surveys have, over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, become a really key piece of data for understanding what poverty looks like in Wales. And it gives us the ability to track living standards over time. This is the 9th report in the series, going back to December 2020. And this is the first one as well since last autumn. So just before we go through some of the results, a bit about the methodology. So YouGov conducts these surveys on our behalf, and respondents are drawn from their panel of over 185,000 people, and the surveys are carried out online. This survey was conducted between the 25th of September and the 6th of October this year. Some of the questions ask people about their experiences of the cost of living looking back over the previous sort of 3 months and 12 months in one case. Some of the questions are about how people are feeling now about things to do with the cost of living, and some of them ask people to look forward to the next 3 months, so looking towards winter. This year, the total sample was 2003 adults aged 16 plus in Wales, which is a bit bigger than what we've achieved in previous surveys. But anything over 1,000 people in these sorts of surveys is considered to be effective in sampling a national population. The results are weighted by YouGov to be representative of the Welsh population. So for this, they use kind of census data, amongst other things. And the real value of that is that we can be really confident that this gives us an accurate picture of the Welsh population as a whole. So if you move on to the next slide, Stefan. So in terms of the overall trend, looking at a population level in terms of cost of living, we can see this first question as kind of a benchmark for tracking living standards. So it's whether people feel they have enough to afford all the basics. So the chart on the screen plots the answers to that question, combining all the respondents who say they're not able to afford the basics, either sometimes, often, or always. And what we can see is that the proportion who answer in this way crept up steadily to 15% of Welsh adults between May 2021 and July 2023. And it was 15% again last autumn. So that clearly shows that the cost of living crisis took a huge toll on the living standards of people in Wales and dragged many more people into hardship than previously. And as you can see, the latest survey that we have has shown a fall of 3 percentage points, so to 12%. And what we think this is showing is possibly a provisional indication that for some people, at least in Wales, the spikes of the cost of living crisis are lessening in intensity. So that would chime with the data that shows that modest growth in real wages compared to the overall inflation in the past couple of years or so. So that's clearly welcome news, but we need to wait to see if that trend continues in further surveys. And it's really crucial to understand that levels of hardship are still sitting well above what we saw 4 years ago. So next slide, please. So in terms of how this is being felt, in terms of the real effects on people's lives, we ask a range of questions that can give us a sense of that, looking at whether people feel they have feel they cut down on various essentials or gone without various essentials. So in terms of food, our previous surveys have shown that people are struggling to afford to access all the food that they need. And that remains relatively unchanged in this survey. So almost a quarter of adults in Wales, 24%, told us that in the previous 3 months, they've either cut down on the size of meals or skipped them for themselves. When it comes to having enough to feed children, we have seen a reduction over the past few years in the number of parents that say they've skipped or cut down on the size of meals for their children. That was sitting at around 20% of parents in January 2023, but that's now down to 13%, very similar to last year. While that trend is clearly welcome, again, clearly it shows still far too many children are having to go without food with clear risks to their health and development. Food bank usage is still sitting at that kind of 1 in 20 or thereabouts level. 4% of adults in Wales say they've had to access a food bank in the 3 months to our survey. So really still very high levels of hardship and evidence when it comes to food. Next slide, please. And when it comes to energy and heating the home, there's not really very much good news here. A quarter of people, 24%, say that they went without heating in the home due to the cost of living and pressures in the 3 months to our survey. So while we may be over the kind of peak of the energy crisis, the average bill is around £500 more than it was in 2021 still, and that's clearly still having a big effect here. Worth noting as well that we asked this question at the beginning of autumn and asking people to look back over the summer, really, the end of the summer. So it's really quite likely that these numbers would increase as colder temperatures hit going into winter if we don't see further support with energy and bills forthcoming. So next slide, please. And in terms of other essentials, again, we're still seeing significant proportions of Welsh adults saying that they're struggling to afford other basics. So in the preceding 3 months to our survey, close to 1 in 5, 18% of people report they were unable to afford new essential clothing. 1 in 7, 15% said that they were unable to replace or repair major electrical goods when they break down, like the fridge or the washing machine, microwave. And almost 1 in 8, 12% say they've gone without adequate furniture in the home. And then transport, more than 1 in 10, 11% say that they've had to miss an essential journey, like getting to work or even medical appointments due to the cost of living as well. Next slide, please. So when it comes to being able to afford basics for hygiene, a large number of people in Wales are continuing to struggle. 1 in 7 adults reported to us that they went without a shower or a bath due to the cost of living in the 3 months to our survey. And 1 in 20, 6%, have gone without basic toiletries like soap, toothbrush, sanitary items. Not being able to keep or feel clean can have huge effects on people's lives. Mental health can lead to social stigma and cause people to avoid or be prevented from taking up opportunities for work, education, or social activity. So it's really important. Next slide, please. And there's really clear picture here on the next slide of high levels of missing out high levels of debt. So we sought to bring out people's experiences when it comes to debt and borrowing. So where people are struggling to afford the essentials, often something has to give, and people often are forced to draw on other funds to stay afloat. And we've seen in previous surveys that there really are high levels of borrowing and falling behind on payments due to the cost of living. And so these are the results from the latest survey. So we see more than 1 in 8 adults in Wales are in arrears of more than a month on at least one household bill. So that's things like credit cards, utility bills, council tax, rent. And 3 in 10, 29% of adults have borrowed money in the previous 3 months because of increased financial pressure. And so just to emphasize that this isn't about unproblematic borrowing, like investing long term because you're feeling confident about your financial situation. This is specifically asking people, have you had to borrow in order to cope with increased financial pressure? So next slide, please. So again, looking over time, that this type of borrowing, we saw a large deterioration really from May to November 2021. If you look at the graph here, those two initial points. So from 17% of Welsh adults to a quarter, that massive jump there. But since then, really the proportion of people who've borrowed money because of financial pressure has steadily increased over the surveys that we've run after that first increase. And that upward trend really is continuing in the latest results. Next slide, please. So we're not really able to get a sense of the real details of the depth of debt that people are in from our survey, but for the first time this year, we've asked people to tell us how their level of household debt compares to their position 12 months ago. And the results are here on the screen. So 1 in 5 people in Wales say that they are more in debt than 12 months ago, compared with 12% of people who say they're less in debt. And there's a significant proportion, if you look on that first bar, 8% of people who say they are much more in debt than 12 months ago. And on the next slide, in terms of the reasons that people say they were more in debt, we were able to ask them why. So as you can see, the most common reason given was that they've experienced an increase in the cost of living. So 68% of people who are more in debt said this. And you can see the effect also that an unexpected bill can have on people too. So 32% of the group who said they were more in debt say the reason they were more in debt was because of things like the car breaking down, needing to be repaired, or a broken down washing machine. Things that many of us would be able to absorb kind of potentially quite easily, that need to be dealt with, can really knock household budgets off course for many people on low incomes. And you can also see that the social security system is causing many people to go into debt because it doesn't cover their needs. So 11% of people who are more in debt say it's because their benefits no longer cover the cost of living. 6% say it's because they've experienced a loss of their benefits or a reduction in them. So clearly, much reason to be concerned here about levels of debt in Wales. On the next slide. We're also seeing hardship continue to take a toll on people's health. So we know there's a body of evidence, growing body of evidence, which shows the link between poverty and worsening health outcomes. There is some positive news here, as we can see on the graph, the proportion of people who are saying that their financial position has had a negative impact on their mental or physical health has been coming down a bit. But still, 4 in 10 adults in Wales say their financial situation has had a negative effect on their mental health. And a quarter, 26%, say that it's had a negative impact on their physical health. So there are clearly implications here for how we think about the link between poverty and public services, whether through worry or serious sort of practical impacts on health. Levels of hardship in Wales are really likely storing up extra pressure on the NHS and many other public services. And we know that a lot of these public services are already really stretched to the limit already. So next slide, please. So moving on to the impacts in terms of breaking it down into various demographic groups in Wales. The survey data does allow us to dig down to see which groups report they're finding life difficult at the highest rate. So while the headline results really suggest that things are bad enough across the population, unsurprisingly, individual circumstances really affect how likely people are to be experiencing hardship. And on the screen, you can see 4 main groups that we think there's reason to be the most concerned about from the most recent data, and very similar to what we found in previous surveys. So people who have a long-term health condition or disability, particularly where that limits their day-to-day activities a lot, that group's come out as one which struggles to a really high degree in previous surveys. Just under a quarter of people, as an example, who have a disability or health condition which limits them a lot, report that they sometimes, often, or always struggle to afford the basics. And that's more than 2.5 times the rate of those who don't have a disability or health issue. That inequality is greater still when it comes to being able to afford the basics often or always, so rather than just sometimes. So 11% of people with a disability limiting them a lot say that they often or always are unable to afford the basics, compared to just 2% of people without a disability or health condition. And people with significantly limiting health conditions or disabilities also report they struggle to afford food for themselves and heat their homes as well, at much higher rates than those without health conditions or disabilities. People who rent, also indicating they find life difficult. So this is amongst sort of private and social renters, but particularly amongst people who rent from a social landlord. Social renters are amongst the groups in our survey that are most likely to need to access food banks. 1 in 10 report they've used one in the previous 3 months. Private renters, they are also disproportionately likely to use them at 7%, but by comparison, the rate of food bank usage amongst owner occupiers is much lower at 2%. Social and private renters also much more likely to skip meals or reduce the size of meals for themselves. 40% and 36% of them respectively say they've done that in the previous 3 months compared to 18% of owner occupiers. Unsurprisingly, people on low incomes come out as one of the worst affected groups. We've also looked at people claiming universal credit, and they are the group that shows some of the highest levels of hardship across the questions in the survey. And families with children under the age of 18 also continue to struggle as well. So it's worth pointing to the fact as well that many of these respondents will kind of be in multiple of these groups. So and those groups that have a higher risk of experiencing hardship, which adds to their likelihood of struggling. So on the next slide. So there's not enough time today to go into everything in the report, obviously, but we'll spotlight some of the differences that exist between groups just to give you a flavour. So taking people on low incomes and universal credit claimants as an example, the next couple of charts really kind of show how much these groups are affected by hardship compared to people on higher incomes. And the threshold we have for that low income is a gross yearly income of less than £20,000 a year. So cutting down on the size of meals or skipping meals due to cost of living pressures, you can see more than twice as many respondents who are on universal credit say they've done this in the last 3 months compared to people in households earning more than £20,000 a year. So 50% of universal credit claimants, 39% of people in households earning less than £20,000 a year. Almost half again of universal credit claimants report they've been unable to afford new essential clothing in the past 3 months, and much higher rates compared to people on higher incomes when it comes to things like going without a shower or a bath or missing out on essential travel as well. So on the next slide, we can also see kind of similar gulfs when it comes to rates of borrowing and debt. So 53% of people on universal credit have borrowed money in the previous 3 months because of increased financial pressure. Well over a third are in arrears of more than a month on at least one household bill, and a third are more in debt than they were 12 months ago, or much higher rates than people in households who earn, which are earning more than that £20,000 a year threshold. And on the next slide, we move on to parents of under 18s and children. We know that this group is at a higher risk of being in poverty, especially where there are young children, so 0 to 4s in the household particularly. And just a reminder as well that 31% of children in Wales are living in poverty, and that hasn't changed much at all really in more than a decade. So when we asked parents in this survey of under 18s about their levels of debt and borrowing, they have higher levels of debt than the population average. So almost 1 in 5 parents say that they're in arrears of at least a month on a household bill. 3 in 10 say that they're more in debt than they were 12 months ago. And the biggest difference on the right there, that they're having to borrow to keep afloat at much higher rates as well. So just to remind you, that population average for borrowing was 29%, but parents of under 18s, 46% say they borrowed money due to increased financial pressure in the previous 3 months. So clearly things are really difficult for many parents of children across Wales, and that's having an effect on the opportunities that are therefore closed off for many children. So on the next slide, we asked parents to tell us whether their financial situation has meant that they were unable to provide their children with a range of activities or experiences. And we can see that really significant proportions of parents are struggling. So just to take a few examples from that chart, we can see 1 in 7 parents say that their child has been unable to take part in sports activities outside of school, like swimming, and the same proportion that their child has been unable to have a birthday party that they want as well. 1 in 10 say that they haven't been able to send their child on a school trip because of the family's financial situation. Similarly to the food question, these rates have dipped a fair amount actually over the surveys when we've asked the question back to January 2024. So again, that's welcome news. Probably demonstrates that where there's a lessening of intensity of kind of cost of living pressures, parents are really quite likely to prioritize their children first before themselves. Um, but it should really remain a really big concern that so many children are missing out on these kind of key activities and experiences in childhood. Where many of their peers are able to take them for granted. And they're not, just to kind of emphasize, they're not extravagant activities like going on expensive holidays. It's things like subs for a sports club, having a bit of spare change, hanging around to allow children to socialize with their friends, things like that. So that gives you a bit of a flavor of kind of some of the gaps between different groups in the survey. So what does it mean, and where does it leave us, and what should we take away from the results? So I think most of you would probably agree that the results are kind of quite stark illustration of how extensive levels of hardship have become in Wales. But there are a couple of points that I think it's really important to make about how we should be thinking about this, especially as we look towards the kind of the Senedd elections in May. So as we saw, the data does indicate that for some people in Wales, the cost of living crisis may be easing enough that they feel that they're able to better afford some of the basics. And we've seen quite clearly that that's kind of manifesting in lower levels of children having to go without, for example. So there really are reasons to be optimistic that things can change. And those kind of stubborn rates that we've seen over the last few years can start to shift. But very large very large numbers of people are still struggling to afford the kind of very basic essentials in Wales. And we really shouldn't forget that this isn't just about the kind of exceptional circumstances brought on by the cost of living crisis, because poverty very clearly predates all of the things that have happened in the last kind of 4 or 5 years. And without big changes, they will persist as well after we're able to say that the cost of living crisis is over, when we're able to do that. And some of you may be aware of the data produced by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation this year, which shows that poverty is deepening in Wales. So we now have close to half of people in poverty in Wales who are in very deep poverty, which is where household income is less than 40% of the median income. And that's steadily increased since the late 90s. So while things may be easing for some, there is that group of people below a certain level who are really likely to be stuck in a pattern of kind of negative budgets and spiraling debt, and modest improvements in inflation rates, and are really not likely to improve that on their own. So the unequal impacts between different groups, as we saw, are really stark. So that there really is an injustice here that needs to be addressed, as a hardship has really significant long-term impacts on health, impacts on children's prospects for future earnings. But I think a key thing to take away from this is that none of this is inevitable. We know there are huge strides which are really there to be made in terms of the adequacy of social security benefits, to make sure that there is a minimum floor, which we say that kind of as a society, we won't let people fall beneath. Everyone should have enough to eat. Everyone should have enough not to go cold. Children should all have the same opportunities to thrive as their peers. And 6 months out from Senedd elections, we know that the next Welsh government will be restricted in what it can do about the benefit system. But there are things that we'll be able to do to reduce the intensity of hardship for people struggling in Wales. And we've produced some work in the last year about some of these potential levers and modelled their effects. And that work is available on our website for people to go and have a look at. But the message here is that poverty and hardship is that they're not going away by themselves. And it really needs to be a priority for all parties looking to form a government next year in Wales. Again, I'll just reiterate kind of there's a lot of detail here in the report, and we haven't managed to kind of capture everything in the report, even from the survey data. So please do give it a read when it's published tomorrow, and stay tuned possibly for some other detail that we might be able to bring out from the results as we return to it kind of over the coming months. But hopefully that gives an overview a bit about where we're at with the cost of living in Wales at the end of 2025. And I'll hand back to Stefan to field kind of any questions that people might have been thinking about while we went through. So, Stefan.
I'm muted. Diolch, Joel. And I think others will agree with me that, it's really quite powerful and sobering seeing some of those statistics, despite some of those glimmers of optimism, perhaps. So yeah, as Joel said, this is the time for you to ask any questions that you have got. I have had a couple of questions in advance. Before we get to those, and whilst you send in yours, I guess the question that I always ask Joel, maybe when he comes to me with kind of a draft or something like this, which I thought would be interesting to explore with everyone, is what surprised you, Joel, in that data? What took you back? What weren't you expecting?
I think it's always I think it's always striking to see kind of because we've got used to some of the kind of the bad news that's just been kind of building over the last few years with the cost of living crisis. It is striking at least to see some improvements, especially since we know that the dial hasn't really shifted that much in terms of any major kind of policy announcements to support people on low incomes kind of over the last couple of years. Um, but again, I think, looking at some of the kind of economic data that we have, it does make sense to a certain extent that gradually we will eventually, barring any further crises, kind of start to see the effects of the cost of living crisis come down. But I think it's just really important, as I said, to kind of separate in a sense that cost of living crisis um, effect from poverty, which, as I said, far predates cost of living crisis, and not to get kind of too carried away when we start to see, those pressures kind of affecting fewer people in Wales. So that was kind of it's welcome, as we say. It's surprising to a certain extent that some of the data on children has seemed so positive. But again, you can see that there are potential reasons for that. If there is a bit of extra money coming in, if people are struggling a bit less, they are obviously going to prioritize their children. Um, I think also the other thing on the other hand, in terms of the good news versus the bad news, I think the the gulf between people on universal credit and low incomes kind of compared to the general population is just really striking. And I think that's always quite shocking if we didn't know about that before, which we did. So possibly not a surprise, but it just really reiterates how important kind of making sure that the support for the social security system is enough for people to afford the essentials, because the gulf is just shockingly high, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. And I guess there was one thing, there's a couple of things I'm reflecting on what you said as well, was that um, what we focused in the write-up on the data on people on the lowest incomes and people going without, etc. But one of the things that is in the data that we haven't teased out in that report is that we're still at a point where fewer than half of people in Wales report that they have enough of the basics and some extras. That's still to set 10 percentage points beneath where it was when we started asking these questions. So if we're thinking about why people might be kind of parties in government are struggling politically, I suspect that is a factor that's going to be playing a part there. So there's an element there as well about kind of, as he said, there are some indications that some things might be getting better, but I think, yeah, it's important that we don't start celebrating, yeah, because it's very 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 modest some of those improvements. So yeah, absolutely. Um, Please feel free to send in any questions you have into the Q&A. I had a question in advance. I think it was from Deb Thomas, who asked, and we might break it down into two, Joel, because it might be easier to do that. So how can we bring to life the depth of poverty, um, kind of, yeah, the depth of poverty that people are facing, and then and what are the pathways out of poverty? So maybe if we take the bringing to life question first, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think lived experience kind of data and information is really important. And that does add that kind of human element, which allows people to understand just how difficult things can be for people. So I think any work around that is welcome. And it is done by various, a huge amount of organisations in Wales working on this stuff, and I think we hear from politicians that that really helps them to communicate the need for more support, more work to be done on this. I do think that. And in terms of bringing it to life, that there really is still also a need for this kind of survey work. I think you can see from some of the results that even though it's kind of like that quantitative kind of aspect of things, it's on a broad population level. It still is very stark, asking people about their experiences of the cost of living. Um, can you afford the basics? It's a simple question, which does give an indication of how difficult things can be for people. And I think the big picture is really important, and driving that home, that kind of the statistics, the more data that we can kind of lived experience and quantitative kind of stuff can really hopefully just carry on driving home that kind of fundamental failure really to shift the dial on poverty. So I think both at the same time really important.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. And the fact that we, maybe have got that press interest tomorrow, but what the press interest wants is that they want, I hate the term, but the human case study is what they're always after then to bring the story to life. So I think that speaks to that the data can cast a light onto this, but that to really let people understand what this data means, having that human element to it is really important as well. I might hold fire on part two because we've had a few questions in, and actually maybe pathways out of poverty might be kind of a nice kind of point to kind of maybe tie things together at the end. So we've got two questions, so I'll take them in order. So one from Lynette Thomas, who's kind of points to some data that highlights families with young children are particularly being adversely affected. Do we find that in our data with families? I know that's not something you've kind of focused on particularly kind of in Variety this time, Joel. But yeah, did you have any comments specifically on that?
Yeah, I think unfortunately, even though we kind of plumped for that slightly larger sample size with this survey, it still restricts us in terms of the demographics that we can really dig into. So we can only really report on parents of under 18s rather than parents with very young children. Unfortunately, it'd be great if we could dig a bit deeper into that because we do know that that is a particular pinch point. Those first kind of 4 years of life are really making making it difficult for families to cope. But I think there's plenty of other data on that available, and we know that it really should be a focus, particularly for the next Welsh government, because we think that they can do a lot in terms of supporting families to get back into work when they've got a child in terms of childcare and things like that. So we know it's important.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, we did some work with as a Bevan Foundation with Bernardo's came out about a year ago actually. I kind of highlighted that and that over half of children living in poverty in Wales live in a family where the youngest child is under 5, and highlighted of course that it's probably the age group that there's less support available from Welsh Government. So I think it would stand to reason that they're a group that have been particularly hardly pressed, squeezed by kind of continuing pressures around cost of living. I've got a question as well then from Mike Bailey, who asks, are the increasing levels of indebtedness partly responsible for glimmers of hope in terms of cost of living crisis easing? Are people simply borrowing their way out of the situation? So am I right in saying, Joe, well, that there's, as you said, there's no indication that the numbers of people in debt has increased overall. So that possibly wouldn't explain it, but we can't rule out the fact that people might be borrowing. Those who are borrowing more themselves, possibly.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to track that new question that we had in terms of are you more in debt? Finding ways of digging into individual levels of debt and depth of debt is, I think, really difficult in terms of survey kind of work. But I know that Citizens Advice has done an awful lot of work and has an awful lot of data about people in negative budgets, which I think is an increasing phenomenon where people are kind of locked into that spiral of borrowing a bit from here, friends and family here, going into arrears here. It's clearly, and I think we can kind of infer from some of the other data that we have available, like that depth of poverty work from Joseph Roundtree Foundation, that there is a large, small, large group of people below a certain level of income in Wales and probably across the UK as well, that where things are just getting worse and worse. And we have things like energy debt. We know that level of debt, for instance, in the market is just getting higher and higher and higher, and people need to prioritize which debts to pay off, which where they kind of focus on in terms of like keeping afloat. So I think debt is clearly a growing issue, and you know, that level of debt that we saw in terms of the borrowing trend, increased financial pressure, have you borrowed? That has dipped from 30 to 29%, but that's within the margin of error, and that trend line is still going up. So I think that this survey kind of just plays into that, and I think it kind of contributes to the indication that it is a growing problem.
Yeah, and I think it's important as well to emphasize that when you use the term glimmer, I think we mean it as a glimmer. The data is, I don't think, conclusive that things are definitely getting better. There's early hints, but it's also equally possible that we come back in 6 to 12 months and actually things are, actually they're all just about around the margin of error, and we could run a survey again in a few months' time. Things have a massively changed of the economy, things might be similar, might be a bit worse, might be a bit better. These are still very early days. They're clear. They're not kind of definite. Yes, finally we've turned the corner. I don't think anyone kind of reading the data, kind of reading the report when you're able to do that tomorrow will be, yeah, can be that complacent about it. This is very, very kind of early on in that process.
Yeah, and yeah, just to come in as well, things can change incredibly quickly as well. We're coming up to an autumn UK government budget now. Depending on what happens with tax, depending on what happens with various things, things could change very quickly for the worse or the better. So I think it's difficult to kind of talk about trends in this case because we've got the kind of the pressures of the cost of living crisis potentially decreasing, but barring another crisis, barring another spike in any sort of costs, it could change very quickly, couldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that maybe then brings us to back to the part two of Deb's question around, yeah, pathways out of poverty, I guess, because that is the fundamental problem underlying all of this, isn't it? It's kind of distinguishing between what's cost of living, what's kind of longer term stuff, it kind of all melds into one. So, yeah, did you have any thoughts on that?
Um, in terms of pathways out of poverty, I think there's a growing a kind of almost consensus amongst interested kind of third sector organizations and kind of thinkers on this that the answers are kind of there, and it's for governments, communities to a certain extent, and community support organizations, but it's for the UK government and the Welsh government to recognize that you have to pull on kind of, I guess, three levers of supporting people into work and back into work. We need a social security system that supports people who don't have enough, regardless of whether regardless of the reasons for that. But also we need action to reduce costs as well. So I don't know if you wanted to talk about some of the suggestions that we had in terms of the next Welsh government, Stefan, but we've talked about making sure there's enough, that there's continuing work in terms of the Welsh benefit system to make sure that people have access to the benefits they need, they have knowledge of the benefits they need, and those application processes are as streamlined as possible. We think that childcare is really important and that the Welsh government could do a lot for that. The current system is very jumbled and it's difficult for parents to even know what help is out there available. But also just increasing that kind of, particularly for parents, for increasing that kind of generosity, if for want of a better word, of the system, so that there are enough hours available, so that people can say, yeah, I have the flexibility here to go out and get a part-time job or whatever, and just increase kind of that household income. So there's lots of things that could be done. Barring any huge announcements about two-child benefit cap and things like that, even the Welsh government has a lot that it can do to kind of lessen the intensity of hardship.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, Joel. I'll share links to the chat actually with people. We've published kind of three manifesto documents kind of to date looking at that. So the first has been looking at, the role of housing and how do we get that supply of social housing, because we think fundamentally that has to be part of the answer. Kind of, that we know housing costs are a major driver of poverty. So being able to boost the supply of social housing. We got a particular briefing that focuses just on childcare because from some of the modelling work we've done with policy and practice, that would arguably be the most effective tool that the Welsh Government has at its disposal, kind of increasing parental employment by increasing the provision of childcare would make significant differences to rates of child poverty in Wales. So that's something that we think bears particular consideration. And then we've got a broader document then looking at issues like you've touched on there, Joel, from Welsh benefit system to free school meals in secondary schools. I think one of the tantalising things in this data that you can't kind of get directly out of it. But I mean, I personally wonder whether what role universal free school meals has played in reducing some of the rates of those children who are going without food. Is that a policy working there? Is that a good news story for the Welsh Government? And other stuff like the importance of the discretionary assistance funds, etc. as well. So I'll share links to those in the chat now if people want to have a look at those in a bit more detail. Um, if there are no other questions from anyone, I'll give people a minute to share them as I post these links. Um, I think that's all I've got to do is to thank you for your time, Joel, and share a report. Ooh, I've had one through very quickly. Um, More people across the UK, I don't know about Wales, are claiming sickness benefits. What impact is that having? Could it be making people better off? Um, without kind of, yeah. So question about yeah, so around that sickness benefits, basically, in terms of, kind of the role of that in the system. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Joel. I think there's obviously kind of what's quite clear from the modelling we've done is that to find long-term solutions, you need action on social security and work. It is not true, as some people argue that work no longer provides solution to poverty. I think work absolutely is still part of the answer. Um, but for a lot of people, the social security system should be there to provide them with a lifeline, and at the moment, it's not doing that. Joel, did you just want to pick up on that from again, reiterate maybe some of the stuff from the data that you picked out?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I think, yeah, I don't really have anything to add on that, Stefan.
Fab. Thanks, Joel. And hopefully people can see the links to those reports coming through now. But thank you very much for your question. And I think that's going to be a very live topic of discussion after the UK government's budget as well. So thank you, Susan, for that. Okay, unless anyone else has any questions, that's all I've got to do is thank you for your time. As I said, we'll get the recording. The recording will be shared with those of you who've attended today very quickly, and the report will be on the website tomorrow. And yeah, if you've got any questions, want to work with us on anything going forward, please pick up with us, and we'll yeah, love to have conversations with anyone. So thank you very much. Cheers. Diolch.